Hey, y'all. I've always believed that the shows that we binge and the movies we love are more than just entertainment. They're a window into who we are and who we might become. They're a place to talk about what truly matters. Welcome to Culture First, Democracy Always. I'm Tasha Pierce. Think of me as your favorite auntie who could talk about the latest sci fi flick 1 minute and then get to talking about voter suppression the next. On this podcast, we break down pop culture from the movies and TV shows you love to the books you can't put down to talk about power, talk about freedom, and talk about survival. We'll connect these stories to our current politics and the constant, everyday resistance we all face. Because culture shapes who we are, and democracy is the freedom to be that person. Culture first, democracy always. Welcome or welcome back to Culture First, Democracy Always. As we move deeper in our Fractured Future arc, we are studying the blueprints of societal collapse. Now, last week we talked the X-Files and the system that controls the story. Today we're dealing with what happens when the system just stops caring. We are diving into one of the most vital episodes in all of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This one is called Past Tense. It is a two-part story. And in this story, Cisco, Bashir, and Dax are accidentally thrown back to 2024 San Francisco, where they find a society that has created sanctuary districts. Those are walled off, segregated zones designed to contain the poor and the unemployed. This episode released like 30 years ago, but as you can hear from that little description, it is most prescient right now. This is sci-fi that's not about aliens. And even though this is a Star Trek episode, it's more of a sci-fi about us. Except for 30 years ago, that seemed dystopian. But this is an era that we are living in right now. We are not very far off from sanctuary districts. And if you cannot tell from the excitement in my voice, Star Trek Deep Space Nine is one of my favorite series of all time. The series has some banger episodes, but this is probably one of my favorite two-parters of all time. So I get to talk about something that I love while sharing some information with you. Anyway, Past Tense shows us how political and economic neglect, failed public policy on housing, on poverty and services, leads directly to authoritarian segregation and the creation of quote-unquote no-go zones. The state wouldn't necessarily have to build a concentration camp. It just has to stop investing in its own people. And of course, we ain't going nowhere without a roadmap, so here's the plan for today. First, we're going to analyze the sanctuary districts as a chilling example of what happens when a government chooses neglect and warehousing over investment and rehabilitation. Next, we'll connect this fictional segregation to real-world urban struggles, the housing crisis, lack of services, and the political rhetoric that labels the vulnerable as threats. Then, we'll talk about how this systemic neglect makes marginalized communities uniquely vulnerable to authoritarian restrictions and surveillance. And finally, we'll talk about the historical duty of intervention, why we cannot afford to let this political failure play out. So, you got it? Good. Let's jump into it. Part 1. The Anatomy of Neglect. All right, let's set the scene, y'all. Cisco and the crew are trapped in the 21st century. So instead of a vibrant, high-tech city, they find a literal nightmare. People who are unemployed, homeless, or struggling with addiction are rounded up and forced into these walled districts called the sanctuaries. The key political insight here is that the sanctuary district wasn't created by a dictator. It was created by a series of rational, seemingly benign policy failures. No one passed a bill saying, let's be evil. They just passed bills that prioritize profit and tax cuts while cutting funding for affordable housing, mental health care, education, and job training. This is a classic political tactic. Neglect disguised as order. The government basically says, we can't solve your problem, so we will hide you. They warehouse the poor, the sick, and the politically inconvenient behind a wall, out of sight, out of mind. And they call that keeping the city clean. Now, this connects directly to the idea of systemic neglect. Historically, we've seen this in redlining, in the failure to invest in infrastructure in marginalized communities, and the wholesale deinstitutionalization of mental health patients without providing community care. The political goal is the same: remove the unsightly problems rather than address the underlying economic wound. So when Cisco and Bashir are trapped inside, they become subject to the rules. Arbitrary curfews, constant surveillance, and the complete absence of rights. They learn that their superior rank and education in Starfleet mean absolutely nothing when the system has already judged them as irrelevant. Irrelevant because, if you are unfamiliar with the characters, Cisco is a black man. Bashir is a brown man. But Dax, the third character who was transported into this alternate reality, she could pass as white. She's a woman and she's very pretty. So she had a very different experience when they landed in the 21st century. Just keep in mind, Cisco and Bashir are irrelevant. Anything that is redeeming about them has been erased upon their arrival in the 21st century without any documents. Keep that in mind. So, a little takeaway from this part of the episode is that systemic authoritarianism rarely announces itself with a march. It doesn't come in twirling its mustache. It arrives through a long series of funding cuts and public policy decisions that prioritize walls over human well-being. Part 2. Segregation as the authoritarian solution. Okay, now let's dig into how segregation becomes the authoritarian solution to economic failure. The sanctuary districts aren't just housing. They are totalitarian containment zones. They operate under martial law, enforced by militarized security forces. Inside the walls, the residents are completely dehumanized. They are stripped of names and given numbers. They are viewed not as citizens in need of help, but as a dangerous commodity to be managed. And in case you can't see it, this parallels the current U.S. urban struggle in a way that is terrifyingly prescient. When we talk about housing crises, homelessness, food deserts, all of this in marginalized communities, we're talking about the conditions that create the sanctuaries: a failed public policy on affordable housing, poverty, social services, healthcare. All of that intensifies segregation. And what happens next? The political rhetoric steps in. Instead of acknowledging the policy failure, leaders will label the disenfranchised as a moral failure or even worse, a threat. They call for increased surveillance. They want to get tough on crime and have those types of measures implemented and harsher restrictions. It could even be an excuse to put the military on our streets. All of that risks deepening the divides and imposing authoritarian restrictions on vulnerable populations. We're seeing this now in the increased reliance on militarized policing and the push for greater surveillance in marginalized neighborhoods. This is the government's way of saying, hey, we failed to provide services, so now we're going to provide some handcuffs. The Deep Space Nine episode shows us what the end stage of that type of policy looks like. So think about your own city, your own town. Where do you see the sanctuary district mentality at work? Is it a lack of public transit, a food desert, a community where there are more police than public services? So share your observations. We need to see where these walls are in our own neighborhoods. Part 3. Vulnerability and the erosion of rights. This two-parter also teaches us a hard truth about vulnerability. When Captain Sisko, stripped of his identity, identified now by a number, he understands what it means to be truly disenfranchised. The episode highlights how quickly civil liberties vanish when you're placed in a zone defined by systemic neglect. Inside the sanctuary, the drumhead's lesson about due process, it doesn't apply. The military police act as judge, jury, and executioner. This is a stark reminder that in our world, when systemic neglect leaves certain groups vulnerable, the government often follows up with authoritarian restriction. The rights of the least powerful are always the first to go. The past tense writers were essentially predicting the political climate where dissent is criminalized. The political climate today, with increased surveillance and the labeling of protesters as extremists, those things risk turning our own vulnerable communities into open-air prisons. Now, the final political move of the Sanctuary District is to control hope. By stripping away the residents' names, identities, their worth, their value, the system attempts to make them forget they are citizens who deserve rights. It forces them into compliance. But Sisko's intervention shows that a single spark of dignity can reignite resistance. In a democracy, when the rights of the most vulnerable are suspended, everybody's freedom is immediately put on borrowed time. Past tense is not just a warning. It's a historical document from the future. It shows us that if we allow crises of housing, health, and poverty to spiral, segregation and authoritarianism will be the inevitable policy solution. Now, the key moment in the episode is when Sisko and the crew realize they have a historical duty to intervene. They can't just observe the past. They have to change it to ensure their own future exists. And that's where we are right now. Your action today is to defend the vulnerable and demand investment, not walls. Support local initiatives fighting for affordable housing, for mental health services, hell, regular health services, and educational equity. Because every time you push for investment, you're tearing down a future sanctuary wall. Next week, we're pivoting to the power of the individual with Doctor Who turned left. And we'll be talking about the fragility of freedom and how your single personal choice, even the smallest one, might have a world-altering impact. It's the most hopeful episode in our arc. And as a reminder, if you want the deeper dive, the historical analysis of systemic neglect, redlining, and the tools to resist urban segregation, this is the perfect time to subscribe to the newsletter before our format changes. Now, you can find the link to join the community for the Thursday newsletter drop in the show notes. Connect with me on Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram at Culture First Always, so we can keep building this community together, because as always, culture first, democracy always. I hope this episode gave you a new way to look at the stories around you. It's so easy to feel alone in this work, but remember, there's a whole community of grown folks out here connecting the dots. If you're not already subscribed, my newsletter drops every Thursday and provides a deeper look at these themes. It's like an email from a friend who's just a little obsessed with connecting culture and politics. You can find the link in the show notes. And also, let's connect on social media too. I'm on Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram, and I just love continuing these conversations with you all throughout the week. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday for the next episode. And I'm Tasha Pierce. Culture first, democracy always.